Hello everyone! Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers, World History Edition. Today we're finally at our First World War, also known as the Great War and the War to End All Wars. We're going to talk about World War I and a general idea of what major events took place during the war. There are a lot of really amazing battles with extremely brave individuals of different nationalities, races, and even genders, but we're not going to be getting into a lot of the individual battles in this video. I personally am just not a battles person, and there isn't enough time in the world to highlight all of the individual battles that took place in these wars. Are we going to mention a few that determined the outcome of the war? Yes, just not all of them in this video. So with that being said, let's get started. In our last class, we mentioned both our underlying main causes of war and our direct in-your-face cause of World War I. Our main causes of World War I include militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Our direct in-your-face cause of World War I, of course, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. There are a few different mnemonic devices that teachers use. I personally like to use main, as we just saw, and then differentiate the difference between the underlying causes in main and the direct cause, aka the assassination. But I know there are also some teachers out there who just lump it all together and use mania, militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, assassination. Whatever helps you remember the causes works fine. They're both great mnemonic devices. Some teachers just have preferences. We also saw two alliance systems develop. The Triple Alliance that included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then the Triple Entente that included France, Russia, and Great Britain. These alliances are going to take action after our direct cause, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We already know that Austria-Hungary gave Serbia demands they knew they couldn't meet on purpose. We know war was the goal for Austria-Hungary because Serbia was itty-bitty and they thought it would be an easy fight. They did not think that Big Brother Russia would come to the rescue. Russia moved their troops over to the Austro-Hungarian border, and they were smart. Russia assumed that Austria-Hungary's allies would immediately jump in. They didn't make the mistake Austria-Hungary did by forgetting about alliances. Russia knew that by threatening Austria-Hungary, they would also be threatening Germany. And as Russia placed their troops along the border of Austria-Hungary, they also placed troops along their border with Germany. They knew what would come next, and they were correct. Germany not only declared war on Russia immediately, but also declared war on France. This was their opportunity. Remember, this whole alliance thing started because Germany and France didn't trust each other. This is Germany's chance to mess with France, so they declare war on both France and Russia. When we introduced the idea of the Triple Entente, we acknowledged that Great Britain promised never to fight against France or Russia, not to fight with them. But Great Britain decides they want to be a loyal friend. Great Britain, as Germany declares war on her allies, declares war on Germany as well. The Triple Entente pulls through for each other at the start of the war, but the same could not be said for the Triple Alliance. Italy was the third member of the Triple Alliance, but they did not agree with the way their allies started the war. They did not want to justify this war by siding with Germany and Austria-Hungary. So, Italy joined France, Russia, and Great Britain. Japan would also join this side of the war, and together they would be called the Allied Powers. Germany and Austria-Hungary will be joined by Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire to make the Central Powers, and they're called the Central Powers because they're located centrally in Europe. Pause. I know it can be so confusing. The Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, the Allied Powers, the Central Powers, I know. It's a lot of different groups. Just know the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente are the friend groups before the war, and the Central and Allied Powers are the friend groups during the war. Remember, the groups with the name triple in them only have 3 countries each, and World War I is going to include a lot more than just 3 countries on each side, so this is a good way to remember it. I also usually get the question of, well, Miss Rogers, which side is the good guys and which side are the bad guys? And World War I doesn't necessarily have good guys or bad guys. A lot of wars don't. It's just disagreements between nations and everyone has a part in it. Now, World War II will be a different story. Anyone interested in genocide is a bad guy. But World War I, again, there isn't really a good guy or a bad guy. Sometimes people think of the Allies as the good guys because here in America, the Allies are the side that the US will join. But if you look at the bigger picture, there isn't really a good or bad. It's just a war. A really big war, but just a war. When World War I started, nations originally thought this war would be over in a couple of months tops. They had no idea it would take years of economic toil, destruction, and a whole lot of death. When we look at the fighting in World War I, we usually differentiate between the Western Front and the Eastern Front. Again, we're not going to get into a lot of the specific battles in World War I, but we are going to describe what life was like on these different fronts, starting with the Western Front. Germany knew that it would be facing a war on two fronts, and as we learned before, that's never a good thing for any nation. Germany's gonna come up with a plan called the Schlieffen Plan to try and destroy the Allies in the West as quick as possible so they could end the two-front war and focus all of their resources on Russia in the East. Focusing on Russia was going to be very important because I'm not sure if you're aware, but Russia is large. Both physically and population-wise, Germany would need to throw their full force against Russia as soon as possible. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Western Front was not as easy as they thought it would be. They originally tried for a huge, quick attack on France, and German troops made it all the way to the outskirts of Paris, but when the Allies regrouped and attacked at the Valley of Marne, it became apparent that the Schlieffen Plan would not pan out the way that Germany hoped. And again, I'm not a huge battles person, but the Battle of Marne is important specifically because it ruined the German Schlieffen Plan. The Western Front settled into a stalemate, or a deadlock, and is symbolized by trench warfare. In trench warfare, soldiers on both sides fought each other from trenches, where these soldiers basically lived. Life in the trenches were miserable. They were unsanitary, rodents running around everywhere, it was impossible to sleep, and fresh food? Yeah, right. Miserable! Fun fact, the trench warfare of the Western Front in World War I saw what was called the Christmas Truce. On Christmas Eve in 1914, soldiers from the trenches of both the Allies and the Central Powers got out of their trenches, met in no man's land, and celebrated Christmas together. They sang carols, they ate together, laughed, danced, and just had a good time celebrating the holidays with one another. It was an event that shocked everybody involved, including the countries in charge of these soldiers. We have all of this new tech, poison gas, tanks, artillery, and yeah, it's doing its job, it's killing a lot of people, but it isn't getting either side closer to a victory. And when I say territory gains were small, I mean that at most, in some areas, the Germans gained 4 miles. The British, in others, gained 5. When I say tiny gains, I mean tiny gains. The Eastern Front was much different than the Western Front. The Eastern Front is where the Russians, the Serbians, the Germans, and the Austro-Hungarians fought. The Russians held their own for a while, going back and forth with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, but it was definitely a struggle for them. The issue for Russia was that they were not industrialized. Where the rest of the Allies and the Central Powers have all of this technology they can mass produce, Russia doesn't have that luxury. The only thing keeping them in the war is their numbers. I think we've mentioned that Russia is a large place, but I don't know if you realize how large the population of Russia is. Russia has such a large population that no matter how many people the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians kill, Russia can just keep throwing live bodies into the fight to pick up the weapons that the dead ones drop. I mean, there's seriously so many people. It's their population alone that kept them in the war for so long. And as this war raged on, the fighting spread well beyond Europe and truly became a global conflict. As world powers tried to end the stalemate on the Western Front, they started taking the fighting to different parts of the world in hopes to make some kind of progress. And as the war reaches new parts of the world, more nations decide to take part in the fight. For example, Australia and Brazil and India all send troops and resources and weapons to assist the Allied powers. Japan attacked German outposts in China. Even colonies in Africa were attacked based off of who they belonged to. The war even reached open waters as Germans declared unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans had been heavily using their U-boats, or submarines, especially in the fight against the British, who had an insanely impressive navy. The Germans declared to the world they would fire at will towards any ship that dared cross British waters. This policy, however, would become problematic when the German U-boats sunk a British ship called the Lusitania. You see, the British ship stowed away ammunition for the war on a passenger ship, meaning that the ship was meant to carry just civilians. The Germans knew this ship had civilians on it, but also knew the British were using the civilians as a shield so they could safely transport resources they needed for the war in hopes the opposing side would leave the civilians alone, and boom, their wartime resources are safely where they need to be. Well, the Germans did not give a care in the world. Their main goal is to win this war, so sorry not sorry, but Lusitania is going down. They did not account for, though, the 128 American citizens on board this ship. And the Americans were not happy. Remember, the last time we talked about the United States, we mentioned their Monroe Doctrine that said, hey, you stay on your side of the world and we'll stay on ours. So the US was trying to stay out of this conflict. That would be hard when American citizens were dying due to the violence going on. The Americans demanded the Germans stop unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Germans did, for a bit, until they didn't, and sunk 3 American ships on their way to England. It's fine. On top of this, the American government intercepted a telegram from Germany to Mexico saying, hey, if you come and be my friend, help me conquer land in Europe a little bit, we can also plot against the United States together. How about that, friend? That was the last straw for the Americans, and it was time for the US to step in, and they joined the war on the side of the Allies. Clearly, they're not going to join the Central Powers when Germany's plotting against them. World War I would become a total war, meaning normal life back home stopped. Everything revolved around the war and what people could do for the war effort, whether that be enlist and go fight, or stay home and literally make, supply, transport anything and everything your troops overseas may need. Toy factories stopped making toys and helped mass produce weapons and other resources soldiers may need. Women took over the jobs of men so that more men could go fight in the war and the country could keep running while they were away. People even ate less food at home and rationed so that there was more to send to the troops and keep their energy up. Total war means nations eat, sleep, and breathe the war effort. This would in part be thanks to propaganda, which was used to constantly keep people motivated to support the war and the troops fighting in it. You had songs about the war effort, you had movies glorifying the war and the troops in it, you had posters, magazines, billboards, anything and everything. The propaganda always made their nation look like the hero, no matter what country. Yes, the German people thought they were the good guys. Yes, the British people thought they were the good guys. Yes, the Austro-Hungarians, the Americans, the Russians. Everyone thinks they're the good guy, and they promote that to their people as well. Help the war effort! We have to save the world from this awful enemy, or all hope is lost. Does that sound familiar at all? Propaganda never really left, it just changes focus every now and then. This total war had been really tough for everyone, especially Russia. Russia is already struggling to keep up. Remember, they aren't industrialized, they just have a lot of people to keep fighting. It's such a struggle for Russia that eventually their soldiers just refuse to keep fighting, and the government has to sign a truce between them and Germany, who easily became the dominant power of the Central Powers. With Russia out of the war, it meant that Germany had no need to send troops to the Eastern Front, meaning no more two-front war for them. The Germans could finally focus their full attention on one front, the Western Front. Ideally, this would be an easy victory for the Germans now, except for one small issue. Those darn Americans. The thing is, the rest of the world has been fighting for years. They're tired. They've already gone through so many resources, lost so many lives. The US didn't. They had an entire nation ready to go of fresh troops not tired or injured from war, resources to spare, fresh enthusiasm that hasn't been tarnished by years of battle. It was exactly the kind of breath of fresh air the Allies needed on their side. The Central Powers attempted their one last hurrah on the Western Front, but it was a little bit difficult with the millions of fresh US troops added to the bunch, and the Central Powers slowly surrendered one by one. First Bulgaria, then the Ottomans, and then the Germans all mutinied until the Kaiser stepped down, and the new German government signed an armistice, or an agreement to stop fighting. World War I was finally coming to an end. World War I left a giant mark on the world. This had been the largest, the bloodiest, the most expensive event the world had ever seen. There was not a side of the world that this war didn't impact, though its largest legacy is going to lay in its peace agreement. The peace agreement created after World War I was created in hopes that another war like this would never happen again. Ever. But we all know World War II exists. It's not like it's a spoiler or anything. The Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that will officially end World War I, and it had stipulations in it that will cause some very extreme consequences for the world. We'll take a closer look at the Treaty of Versailles and all of its stipulations in our next class, so I'll see you then.